Hello and welcome to Black, Brown, and Bilingue, where our mission is to unite the Black and Brown communities through education, storytelling, and community engagement.
The vision of Black, Brown, and Bilingue is to be part of creating a world in which Black and Brown identities are affirmed, bilingualism and biculturalism are nurtured, and equity is the driving force behind all that we do. Thank you for joining us again today. I am Lissette Jacobson, and I am one of your hosts.
And I'm Maurice McDavid. I'm your other host.
Folks, this is just surreal, the episode that we have prepared for all of you today. If those of you who listened to season 1 and maybe the episode, what episode number was it, Maurice? The Black Brown Divide. I want to say it was episode maybe 2 or 3.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a continuation of that episode. And if you recall, in that episode, I referenced a book that kind of highlighted this Black and Brown divide for me way back when I was a high school student in Waukegan, Illinois. And the title of that book is called The Presumed Alliance. And it was written by Nicolas Vaca. And our guest today, again, it feels so surreal, is the man himself, Nicolas C. Vaca. I can't even believe it. Again, I'm a little shook.
So, again, as Lissette said, we are ecstatic to have you here on Black, Brown, and Bilingue. We are both educators by nature, but I think even more than that, we are inquisitive folk. And so in our initial conversation, Lissette had mentioned this book. And so since then, I've purchased it on Kindle, I'm making my way through it. And one of the things that comes up is you kind of talk about during the 1960s, this idea that relationships, the relationship between Blacks and Latinos was kind of viewed through these rose-colored glasses. Right. You talked about having seen Malcolm X speak. So help me to figure out, how does this Mexican-American young kid end up in a space where you're watching Malcolm X speak? What was that like? And can you talk just a little bit about that experience of the civil rights for you?
Yeah, let's see. I grew up in the Central Valley of California, a small town with the name of Stockton. And I ended up going to junior college for 1 year. And then you'll find this somewhat ironic. I had a close friend, a Chinese American friend. And by the way, because I'm in California, I had a lot of Asian friends. The high school I went to had a large Asian population, Chinese, Japanese American, and a lot of the Japanese American students who were there were born in relocation camps. So one of my closest friends was a fellow by the name of Norman Hong. And one day he says, "Hey, look, I'm going up to see my sister at Berkeley. You want to come along?" I said, "Sure." Never been anywhere outside of Stockton much. So I went up there, and his sister was attending it was her third year there, and her name was Maxine Hong Kingston. I don't know if you remember the book called Woman Warrior. She was the first of the Asian American women to write a novel. She was incredibly impressive when I met her, and I decided that I wanted to go to Berkeley. Little did I know that you should apply to more than one university, but I applied to Berkeley only, got into Berkeley, and ended up going there. I was there that, free speech movement began, the civil rights movements began, the marching against Vietnam happened there. It was an incredibly exciting time, just really, really exciting. And yeah, I remember like it happened yesterday, watching Malcolm X speak, and found it really just an absolutely amazing thing. He was electrifying when he spoke, absolutely electrifying. That's what I ended up there, ended up going to grad school there, and then ended up going to law school eventually. But that's kind of the abbreviated version how I got to Berkeley and how I saw all those wonderful things.
Now, can you speak to what the audience was like? Was it a diverse group? Was it predominantly a Black group? What was it like? And, as a Mexican man, did you feel out of place or did you feel pretty comfortable in that space?
You mean when Malcolm X spoke?
Yeah, being there and hearing.
Yeah, well, Malcolm X spoke was largely white because at that time, Berkeley, like most universities, was largely white. And so I found one of the most incredible statements he made was, we've got to kill or get rid of the blue-eyed devils. And I was amazed because I was watching white people just clapping, going crazy, saying, yeah, get rid of the blue-eyed devil. Never realizing that he was really talking about them or they were an exception to the blue-eyed devil. But you have to understand also, when I was at Berkeley, I was one of 50 Latino students and probably one of 40 Mexican-American students at Berkeley out of a population of 20. So we were just minute. There was nothing there for us, for me when I got there, in terms of being a Latino identification. There was nothing there. It was largely a white university. We had very few African-American students as well. So, it was, how can I say? It was just a continuation, I believe, of my experience in when I first got there, and also in kind of higher education, where it's largely white.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you find yourself in situations where you're the only, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by this idea, and I know we've kind of laughed at it, of them clapping to him saying we've got to get rid of these blue-eyed devils, but I think it almost speaks to this idea that they were just engaged by him as a speaker, right? Because he was articulate, and it's almost that idea of exceptionalism, that they weren't really even that interested necessarily in what he was saying, as much as the fact that he was there, this celebrity, Black celebrity figure was there speaking to them.
Well, it's almost too like, you might liken it to today where you have white protesters marching with Black Lives Matter. You're always going to have those allies. And so that's the first thing that I thought of was when you said, like they were clapping and things like that. So I think through history, we have seen there have been, white folks who have been allies for civil rights movements.
Yeah. And, this was also, I was there during the time when students went to the South for voter registration. One of my close friends, Hardy Fry, who is somewhat notable in the African-American history in terms of civil rights movement in the South, was one of the activists down in the South doing voter registration. So you always had this element of white students who supported whether it was civil rights movement, whether later on the women's movement. So you always had this element of white people who actually supported the liberal causes. Again, whether it was Cesar Chavez, whether it was the Black Panthers, which was another interesting element when I was there as well, because it was in Oakland. It was originally in Oakland, and I used to work in Oakland under a work-study program. Mm-hmm. So it was an exciting time. It was a very exhilarating time. But through it all, as I pointed out in the book, I realized that even though Latinos and African Americans were supposed to have this sort of unity, this closeness, this shared oppression, that at times it became a contest between the two. Mm-hmm. There was vying for resources, whether it was Chicano studies, in those days it was called Chicano studies, or Black studies. There was always, because there was a limited amount of resources, so there was this constant struggling back and forth. It was that time also there was a big move to bring in African American professors in the Department of Sociology, where I was, and Harry Edwards ended up going to Berkeley, who later on became the icon on sociology of sports. And we had Troy Duster, who also became somewhat of an icon. We never got a Mexican American professor there. I think they had one there, and I think she's gone there. But the whole time that I was at Berkeley, as a graduate student and undergraduate student, we never had a Mexican American professor in Department of Sociology.
Mm. It's sad. It's unfortunate because there's still spaces where we're like, there's no Mexican American representation. And that's actually an area that I'm extremely passionate about because, there's a ton of nuances, but I want to get back and make this about you. Funny story. I still have the book from the library. I never returned it, and they must have sent me to collection, y'all. I still have the very book that I loved it, and I just was completely because I had seen some of that friction and that conflict in my own community, but no one was talking about it. And so I think you really gave it a voice for me. So, can you take us to where did this presumed alliance, where did the idea of the book come from? And in your opinion, who was making that presumption back then of this presumed alliance?
The way it came about was kind of unusual. When I was practicing law, I began an immigration practice in Central Valley, Stockton, where I came from. And I had all these wonderful clients, and they had these really interesting stories to tell. So I used to write fiction as well. In fact, my PhD dissertation at Berkeley was a novel. I was writing these short stories, and one day I decided to send them to the California Lawyer, which is a magazine that all attorneys subscribe to in California. Actually, it's given to us free. And just by chance, I sent a short story, and the editor was a real sympathetic individual towards the Latino Mexican American movement, as it were. And he called me and says, "Hey, look, we'd like to publish it." So make a long story short, I ended up publishing 10 of these stories in the magazine. Mm. I then decided I wanted to write do a book of short stories, put a collection. At that time, the author of the Presumed Alliance, the publisher of the Presumed Alliance, HarperCollins, had a Latino press. And I put together the short stories, sent them off to them, and they didn't think they were the best thing in the world. But they said, "You got a really interesting background. Do you think you'd write a book on Latinos or Mexican Americans?" I said, "I guess." And so I put together a book proposal, which I had never done before, and sent it off. And they say, "We love all the chapters, but you have this one particular chapter on African American Latino or Black Latino conflict. Can you expand on it?" And that's how it came about. It was just one chapter in a book, and there was a fellow by the name of Rene Alegria, who was the editor for the HarperCollins press for the Latino version, and he's the one that says, "Yeah, let's do that, Nick." So that's how it came about. And I told him that it would. I said, "Look, it may really not fall on sympathetic ears in certain communities." I said, "But if you guys are willing to do it, I'm willing to do it as well." So that's how it came about.
Interesting.
Yeah, that idea that it won't fall on empathetic or sympathetic ears is intriguing, Mr. Vaca, because I think you're on to something here.
I saw an interview that you had. It was a few years back. Actually, go ahead and get back to the question, Maurice. I was going to say, because there's this man that did the Latino American series. I think it's for PBS, and he's in an interview with you. What is his name? I'm trying to remember. Oh, it was years ago. Yeah.
Really? There was an interview with me?
You were part of a panel, and this.
Oh, yes. Yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
His name was Montejano?
Yes.
Yes.
I love
he was a professor.
I watched it twice.
Yeah. Montejano was actually came to Berkeley as a graduate student, and then he was a professor for a short period of time there. Then went off, I believe, to New Mexico. Ended up publishing a really significant book, and came back to Berkeley. I think he was in the Chicano Studies program. I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, David.
But that was really interesting. That was really interesting because my good friend Hardy Fry that I mentioned before was on the panel itself, and he and I had had our differences of opinion. I love the guy dearly, but we always had our differences of opinion. And there was a very interesting panel because I remember coming out of there, because this was at Berkeley at the university, and I remember just coming out saying, God, I really took a beating there. There was nobody in that in that group that was sympathetic to what I was saying. Not one. It was sort of like, well, this is just an example of you dividing and conquering. You're helping the white people divide and conquer us. And I kept saying it's not a matter of dividing and conquering. It's a matter of looking at reality the way it is. And by that time, I had left academics and knew that in academics, if you were to raise this as an issue, you could become a pariah in your academic community. As a lawyer, I didn't give a rat's. It was just, that's what lawyers do. Lawyers, try and bring out the truth. So I do remember coming out of there saying that was the worst encounter I ever had. Had Latinos from Puerto Ricans, I had Cuban Americans, I had recent immigrants from Mexico, all of them just really upset with the content of the book. And if you remember correctly in the introduction, there is a fellow Chicano who stopped talking to me because of the book. He just didn't think it was necessary for that book to come out. He says, you're airing dirty laundry in public.
Yes. Yep.
But can I tell you something, Maurice? I had they did a publicity tour for me. HarperCollins did, and I got to be on radio programs throughout the United States. A lot of them Black American programs. Black programs from I remember one in Washington D.C., Chicago, and the like. And the people that were most sympathetic were the African Americans. They're the ones that kept saying, yep, this is the elephant in the room. We got to talk about it, And I remember some of them were really blunt. They were they said, one person called in when I was in the radio program in Washington, D.C., and he says, there used to be a place up here that used to be largely Black. He says, now it looks like all of El Salvador moved in there. And I remember going back to D.C. because I had spent the summer of 1966 in D.C. when it was called the Chocolate City. And so when I went back, I had not been back in many, many years. I expected, to see Chocolate City again. I go to this California pizza place. That's the name of the restaurant. And first person who greets me, somebody with a little badge on it says Honduras. Then the waiter came in. His name was Mexico, and it was largely Latino. So I saw the dramatic change the Latino population had on the African American community in Washington. And I went back there recently to speak at the Smithsonian, and I saw the same thing again, changing neighborhoods. But I was always impressed with the fact that the African Americans were the ones that really wanted to talk about this and accepted the reality that there was a conflict between Latinos and African Americans. And the argument they always made to me was they said, well, you guys aren't a race. Because this is when the Latinos became the largest minority, quote unquote. And they said, you guys aren't a race. You guys are a bunch of ethnic groups mingled together. So you really can't say you're the largest minority, because you really just you're not a race, you're an ethnic group. And you're made up of all these various groups, which I thought was absolutely true. Absolutely true. But the other argument I made with him, I said, look, we're going to be the largest minority, but we're never going to replace African Americans in the American psyche. It's just not going to happen. So anybody thinks that just because we're the largest group, somehow we're going to replace African Americans in the American psyche is out of touch.
Again, that maybe so Lissette and I were talking before you came in at the interview, and maybe that's it. Maybe that's what I was trying to say, Lissette. Lissette asked me, because I said, I was really interested in the idea that, like, the Black community is not going to grow at a rate to be able to keep up with the growing Latino community. It's just not going to happen. And she said, Maurice, how do you feel about that? Yeah. And I said, I don't know. I don't know how to, but I think that you just said it well. I think that Black people, for good or for bad, hold a specific place in American history and now current reality. And so I think that's really what I was going to try to get at anyway. So
much more eloquently, Maurice's response was, because Black people, we're dope. that was Maurice's full answer.
Right. Yes. Yeah, we're dope. And she said, what do you mean? I asked about population change, and you said Black people are dope. And I what I was trying to get at was Black people hold this place.
Right.
They hold this place. And so it's a sui generis place as far as I'm concerned. There's nothing you can do to eradicate that. Let me let's say, since I didn't know what you really look like. I saw the drawing, but to be, I didn't really know what you were going to look like.
Here we go. Uh-huh.
No. But what? And I mean, one of the things that is unique about the African American community versus the Latino community is this: if you're African American, whether you have a drop or two or whatever, and you're traveling through the United States, you're going to have a certain reaction from white people to you or other people to you. Okay. If you meet an African American who's from New York and the African American from Los Angeles, they get together, they meet together. They have a shared experience. They both have suffered profiling. They've all been stopped by the police. You meet a Latino from Miami with one from Los Angeles. That may not happen. Particularly if you're a white Cuban. You may never have that happen. So the kind of unity that as a result of shared experience for African Americans is unique. And that is why I think you can have this cohesive voting bloc, this cohesive movement, because it's a shared experience. You don't have it with Latinos. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, we've talked extensively about the fact that Latinos are not a monolith. Black folks aren't a monolith either, but just purely, like you said, because some things are like more visible.
In my own family, we have very light-skinned, individuals. And if you walk down the streets of South Carolina, they won't know. Maybe they won't know what to make of you.
Yeah.
But if Maurice walks down the street of South Carolina, they know exactly what Maurice is and how to react to. And I think that's all I'm trying to say is that we can't equate our experience with the African American community. And I know that people say, oh, yes, we got to talk about police brutality against blacks and then browns. Well, yeah, it's true. But, my assessment is that African Americans are far greater, are more likely to be subjected to police profiling than Latinos, particularly if you look white. Mm-hmm. And God knows enough of my classmates at law school were white Latinos. Mm-hmm. I rented a place in Boston where I knew an African American couldn't rent, but I passed. Yeah, they allowed me to do that.
Yeah, you earlier talked a little bit about the psyche, right? And in the book, you mentioned that you read a lot of Black authors, and you made 2 points. You really didn't see Latinos represented in Black literature. And number 2, you realize that Latinos bring a different psyche when they interact with Black folks and white folks because of that guilt.
Correct.
That sometimes white folks feel that Latinos don't necessarily have that that experience. They don't
That's right.
that guilt. And
Right.
those things stood out to me because, number one, I thought to myself, man, you're right. I don't recall reading any Black literature and finding any Latino representation growing up. And again, it was
Right.
like I was invisible. My culture was invisible. Like I really didn't know where to fit. But number two, I had never thought about how, when white people interact with Black folks, there's a lot of guilt. And Latinos, because we don't feel like we are to blame for a lot of the perils and the strife that the Black community experiences, we don't carry that with us. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. That's the way. That's what I had seen all along, and I saw it at Berkeley, particularly. Remember when I said the White Devils, and Malcolm X said the White Devils, and all the White Devils clapped because. But you couldn't say that about Latinos. It just didn't work for Latinos. And so whenever I interacted with my fellow African-American classmates, and as a grad student in Berkeley at sociology department, it was very different than when I would saw white liberals interact with them. And it was like a sense of deference, a sense of guilt. And Maurice, I don't know if you ever had that experience where you run into a white liberal and they bend over almost backwards to prove that, in fact, there's not a drop of prejudice in them.
We just talked about this.
Yeah, Lissette and I. So one of the episodes, in fact, what is probably going to end up being the opening episode for season 2, is talking about exceptionalism, and just the idea that I think Lissette, you said it well, that there are people who like me, but they like themselves more for liking me, and so it's kind of like, oh yeah, this is Maurice. He's Black, but listen, he is phenomenal. Especially, if they hear me and I start hablando español y yo puedo comunicar con la comunidad allí también. Oh, not only that, but listen, he is truly, and it's just kind of like, we could talk about sports. We don't have to talk about race and politics every time I see you.
The way I described it in the episode is like, if someone were to be called out for, racism or bias, Maurice would be the person they'd point to as like, I love Maurice, so therefore I cannot be racist. But I got this more. So again, I feel like, because I have seen it and we work together, and I have seen people be in awe of him. And again, you just get that vibe of like, he is great though. He's my friend, so I think I'm a little biased there too, because he is a wonderful person. But I have seen how people will literally be just in awe by Maurice. And it's not even so much because of who he is, it's because how they feel for liking him. Yeah,
that's true. It's kind of, Maurice, what you said, I can't possibly have any kind of animus towards African Americans. I like this guy. Yep. So I can't possibly have animus towards him. So I just find it curious. Let me ask you, Maurice, how do you feel about this thing that's going on with Prince Harry and Meghan? I mean, they keep talking about her being African American. Do you view her as African American?
So that's a great question. Here's what I will say. As a former history teacher, I understand well the concept of the one-drop rule.
Right. Okay.
And so in that sense, absolutely, she's African-American. Folk talked about even our current vice president that perhaps did not always identify as African-American, perhaps identified more, with this or with that. But that I think even speaks to what you said earlier about Black people holding this space right in society. Is there are times where it becomes powerful or beneficial to say, oh yes, I identify with the Black community, and now I get to identify with that oppression. When that oppression becomes a medallion that I get to wear on my shirt, right? Like, look at what I've been through. Then people want to identify with being Black, even though maybe that oppression has not been felt in the same way that it has for the person, again, whether that's with darker skin or growing up in a different place or with more poverty or whatever it may be. So I do think one of the things that it opened up, and I had the opportunity to study abroad in Spain, one of the things that it opened up this whole thing with the royals was that while everybody pretends like America is super racist, we're not the only ones who have issues with race, right? And I discovered that when I was in Spain and Obama was elected, and they were like, "What? Un negro? ¿Qué pasa?" And they're like, "Never," right? And so now all of a sudden we see Great Britain, which always prides itself on, we ended slavery in the 1800s. We decided it was bad, but did you fix a mentality of white supremacy? And if not, then, we still have to deal with that. So that brings me to a question, though, back to this conversation about Latinos and Black people and this presumed alliance. You talked a little bit about Black Latinos. Can you talk
Afro-Latinos? Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk some more about that? When I was a middle school Spanish teacher, I always tried Black History Month. I'd bring up Afro-Latinos, right? As kind of like this connection to the curriculum and also Black History Month. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the things that you shared in the book related to that? Darkly complected speakers.
Yeah, well, in New York, that's a big thing. As in Miami, when you start speaking Spanish, somebody say, "Oh, he's Dominican." Because you could be Dominican. The thing about the Afro-Latinos was, I think they have a much tougher cross to bear than either Latinos or African Americans, because they're really bridging two cultures, and one may feel. Because in Los Angeles, you see a lot of intermarriage between Mexican Americans and African Americans. And I always thought that's really odd, because in the sense that they both have, the kids must really bear a tremendous responsibility for representing their respective cultures. And when I was on my tour, I would get calls from Afro-Latinos saying, "Well, what about us? How do we fit into this picture?" Sure. And, the statistical argument is that there are not that many Afro-Latinos. On the other hand, there are enough to make it an issue and to address it. I like the comment you made earlier that even one drop of Black blood makes you Black. And again, perceived bias would argue that if somebody shows up and they look African American but are Afro-Latino, they will be classified as African American. So I think it's a much more difficult road to hoe than it is for either Latinos or African Americans. There's one thing I want to point out, and that is that I got a lot of comments from people who would say, "Hey, well, look, my daughter's married to an African American, or my son's married to a Latina. How can you make these arguments that there's this divide between this conflict?" And the same thing I would also get from politicians who would say, "Oh, on the Hill, we all work together." And my response was, "Yeah, I have no doubt about that, And the book is not really about interpersonal relationships or political alliances. It really is more about individuals and, street people, and how they get along and how they deal with the world. So I always had a hard time with that, because, if somebody tells me, "Well, my daughter's married to an African American," my response was, "Okay, that's great. I mean, that's your situation." But, it doesn't belie the fact that as a group, there is that conflict. And I don't know if either one of you have experienced it. I saw it, like I said, at Berkeley firsthand, and then I saw it later on in the affirmative action programs, where there was this contest between Latinos and African Americans. I don't know if you may not be old enough to know this, but there was set-aside programs by cities and states, Latino or African American owned businesses, certain kind of business. And at that time, I had my own law firm, and I was obviously Latino owned. And we were in constant conflict and contest with African American law firms trying to get business from institutional clients, because institutional clients are the ones that pay the big bucks. So it was, it's something I think to some degree still exists. Maybe not as much. I sort of fell back into the practice of law and haven't kept up too much with what's going on. But I just find it. I still think it exists for whatever reasons, and I don't know if you experience unusual situation because you have Puerto Ricans.
Yeah,
you have Puerto Ricans. Go ahead.
Yeah, we do, and that's exactly why we made the episode. And like I said, I read your book as a high school student, and the reason why I gravitated towards it is because I was experiencing those day-to-day conflicts. Right. I would hear kids in school say things. I would hear families say things. And like you mentioned earlier, it's like, how dare you air out our dirty laundry? If you hear a tío or a tía say something that's, bringing down, the black person down the street, our black neighbor, and we can't say that publicly or we can't call them out. It's like, how dare you? And so even at that young age, even though I didn't have all of the understanding that I have now, to me, writing your book, I could tell that it was a brave thing that you did, because Latinos do not talk about it.
Right.
Not talk about it.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say, in our previous episode, season 1 episode, Black Brown Divide, I told a story from my childhood in which my auntie had some pretty disparaging remarks, let's just say, about Latinos and the rate at which they have children. Okay, and
500, I remember correctly, right?
So it definitely was something that was present in that moment. I can then say from that point forward, I don't know that I really thought about it as much because I was so focused in on like the black community and like, the black-white relationship that I didn't think about it a bunch until I became an educator, and oftentimes was the only person in that space who was different. And so then all of a sudden I connected with my Latino students because I spoke Spanish, and my black students because I was black, and I realized, like, oh, wait a second, this is happening because neither of them have anybody else who looks like them or speaks like them in the whole building. Right. So they're connecting here. But then I also noticed that they were connecting in groups apart from one another. Yeah. That even though I was kind of this hub, they were not connecting with one another always.
And I think it's also important to note that Maurice and I grew up in vastly different communities. Maurice's community was predominantly white, whereas mine was literally like that salad that we talk about. It was Latino, it was Asian, it was black, it was white, it was Middle Eastern. Like, we had everything. And I think that that's exactly why we had that conflict, because we were essentially competing for the same resources. And as the demographics continue to change, it just became more and more evident that there was a conflict. And do you think, though, in your opinion, like, is there a way to, one, I guess, is, do you think that there's still this idea of a presumed alliance, like this black-brown divide? Because I know that's a very, loaded phrase, right? The black-brown divide, people still get uncomfortable. So do you think that still exists? And do you think that we can...
I think the divide exists, but I don't think it is as visible as it used to be. I keep listening to the politicians keep talking on police reform about the black and brown. And I just keep thinking that, again, depending on who you are and where you're at and what you look like, it's not the same. It's just, I just don't see, and I could be totally wrong, because there are certainly enough Latinos in prison in California and elsewhere to attest to the fact that there's a disparity in the judicial system and the criminal procedure that forces more and more Latinos into prison. But I have not. I don't know that it still exists in the same way that it did when I was in the 60s and 70s. I think maybe things have changed. You're probably more in tune than I am, because you got feet on the street, and you guys know what's going on. But I don't. I live in a neighborhood which is 99% white, so I don't see it. And the East Bay, where I live, is largely. I think we have Latinos. My practice, ironically, now has become mostly Latino, and not only Mexican Americans, but Salvadorians, Hondurans, and the like. But I don't know that it exists anymore. What's your opinion? What have you guys found?
We think it does, to a certain extent.
Okay.
I think it's again, it's that elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about.
Right.
And because I think some people think that it takes away from the energy that it takes to fight against white supremacy. And so I think it's like, why are we going to talk about this man-made or white man-made idea?
Right.
When we should be uniting and fight white supremacists, because they're the real enemy. And so I understand that. But again, I think it's that elephant in the room that we don't want to acknowledge because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, I got a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah, I was going to say, it sounded like in the research, it sounded like you got a lot of, even just in that introduction, like you said, your friend who was like, nope, if you're going to talk about this, I'm done.
Yeah.
I will say, looking at this summer's experiences, post George Floyd, I saw a connection that I don't think I had seen previous. I saw Black and brown people marching together. And I, there was a story written about it, and I forget what that source was, but there was a story written about it, and how this summer's protest really did maybe begin the process of bridging that divide a little bit more, right? It continued that process of what has happened over time, because I think there is power in that idea that there is a common enemy, that the system is that common enemy, and so how can we unite? So yeah, I definitely think it's still there. But
we're forever.
I think yeah.
Well, let me tell you, for about 8 months, I was CEO of a nonprofit organization that ran 6 charter schools. And it was during the time that I was the CEO that we had the George Floyd situation. And I was encouraged, and I did. I wrote a piece to be distributed to all the members of the academic and staff community for the charter schools. And mind you, our charter schools were in Oakland, which has a large African-American population. Well, you guys know about Oakland. And Richmond, which also has a large African-American population. So I wrote it and I put it out, and the first people who came to talk to me were 2 senior African-American employees. Because in that piece I wrote that, that every African-American saw George Floyd. They saw themselves in George Floyd, and there but for the grace of God go I. And I put that in the piece. You could have a PhD, you could be an electrical engineer, you could be a nuclear physicist, you could be an astronaut. But if you're walking down the street, you're still Black. And you're susceptible to the kind of an abuse and kind of danger. And I think that's the appropriate word. The danger that African-American males suffer, if maybe females as well, I'm not that well acquainted, just by existing. And like I said, I had 2 senior African-American males come in and tell me that was important to them, for us to understand how vulnerable African-American males are in an everyday existence. So Well, I could sympathize with him. And I wrote that. It's not something I've ever experienced myself. It just never happened to me. I mean, I can't say I was never a victim of stereotyping or profiling or the like, but certainly not to the extent that I think that African American males are profiled.
Mm-hmm. That's incredibly well stated, and I'm going to assume that there will not be a sequel to the Presumed Lie.
No, but I did tell you. I tell you what the sequel I wanted to write. The title was Deconstructing the Latino Monolith. And I wanted to look at the Latinos and how we became this quote unquote Hispanic Latino, which really was a result of the 1970s movement to aggregate everybody for political power.
Yep.
But, the reason that I went from state to state was to show the Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, and how they reacted to the African American population. Now, mind you, in each one of those, there was this conflict. But we don't, as Latinos, the people that called in and told me, well, you guys are not a race, were absolutely right. We're not. And we're as diverse as can possibly be. I remember being in San Francisco. They had gotten together all these individuals who were, quote unquote, were power brokers in San Francisco. And we had Mexican Americans, we had Chileans, Colombians, just a variety of Latinos. Right? And the first thing they started talking about was who speaks the best Spanish. And of course, we know that Mexicans do. But also, and they kept saying, well, what's this Dia de los Muertos? Colombian said this. We don't celebrate this in Colombia. And it was this kind of resentment of everybody. If you're from Latin America, you're Mexican. If you're from South America.
Here's my thing, though. This is where I go. Why is it so offensive to be confused for Mexican? Like, the disdain. You should write this book. And can I contribute to it? Because let me tell you. Here's the thing. It's extremely, I think, offensive if someone were to say, hey, Lissette, are you Colombian? Are you this? My response wouldn't be like, no. You know what I mean? But I think call a Puerto Rican a Mexican or call a Colombian Mexican, immediately it's like, no, I'm not Mexican. And I think within our own, Hispanic or Latino community, there's a hierarchy,
Oh, yeah.
The looks down to the Spanish, that who speaks Spanish. And I still, though, being the Mexicana that I am, we're the largest group here. So maybe I'm going to edit that out. But truthfully, it's like, excuse me, there's been a lot of work done by the Latino community and Mexicans in particular to even get to the little piece of the pie that we're at right now.
That's correct. I mean, that's correct. I said that in the book. If you break down the numbers, and I remember I think I told you, I told Brett this. I would, right after the book came out for about 4 or 5 years, I would be invited to Chicago to speak at an organization called UNO, which ran charter schools in Chicago. And I remember the second time I went to speak, because I had Latinos from all of Chicago, different kinds of Latinos. I remember one Puerto Rican fellow came up to me and says, I never realized the difference in numbers. You guys are the big dogs. I said, yeah, but, it doesn't always represent itself. But the other issue, other than the cultural difference, is the political issue. Mm-hmm. People talk about the Cubans as being, Latinos. Well, they are, but, they vote Republican, And when the Cubans came to Florida, who came? It was largely the wealthy, the educated, the ones with money. Yeah. It was until you got the Marelitos who came in, who were the black Cubans. Mm-hmm. So I think that in terms of political speech, the disassembling of the Latino monolith has to be done for people to understand voting patterns and the like. Because even among Mexican Americans, there's generational differences. When I was in Chicago, I remember one fellow told me, I was in the Marines. I met these guys from LA, and frankly, I had more in common with an African American friend from Chicago than I had from those Latinos from LA, because I didn't know what the hell they were talking about half the time.
Yeah, and here's another one, and I think in this latest election, right, when we talk about, I just heard a lot and read about how Latinos voted, and can you believe Florida? Can you believe Florida helped elect Donald Trump? And I remember sitting there like, can we talk about Arizona? Why?
Right.
Arizona was flipped. Why are we not talking about Arizona? Well, who's there? But suddenly the media only focused on, oh, look at how Latinos voted in Florida. And that to me showed their ignorance, because they didn't take the time to fully understand who it was that they were talking about. And they painted us all with one brushstroke. Whereas had they just... Go ahead.
No. And Maurice, this is the difference. You go to Georgia, you have African-Americans, 99% vote Democratic. It's because they have a common experience. Mm-hmm. We don't have it with Latinos. Don't have it. I don't have anything in common with the Cubans in Miami. I have nothing in common with it. I'm sure that I have very little common with Puerto Ricans in New York City, but yet we're all lumped together as Latinos. And I like I said, that was the book I wanted to write, but it was not something that HarperCollins actually Arroyo Press went south, so I was never able to follow up on it. But that I think is the book that has to be written.
It definitely is, because again, when we talk about having our needs met, right? Because who are the policymakers trying to appeal to when they talk about the Latino vote, right? And if we don't have our interests represented, it's just so discouraging. It's extremely discouraging. And you talk about that generational differences too. I think if here's where Republicans, and I don't want to make this a bipartisan issue, but this is where Republicans really mess up in their disdain for Latinos for the most part. We're largely like Catholic. If they were a little nicer, they would find that they could probably persuade more Latinos to vote Republican if they just took the time to get to know what are the things that matter to us, what are the issues that we care about.
Yes, absolutely.
But they don't take the time to understand those nuances and how religion. Sorry, Maurice, I know you're trying to jump in, but let me just have this moment. That if they just took the time, I vote Democrat, that's me, but if they just took the time to understand, they perhaps would get more of the Latino vote that they so desperate, like so much fear. They have so much fear of like the Latinos becoming the majority. Well, if you were nicer, you could probably get more of us to vote for y'all, but you don't.
All right. So let me just jump in here real quick with two things, right? Because I am a pastor, right? And so I think I represent, though, this idea that there are Black people who have this conservative core because of their faith. You talk about the power of religion, and yet politically it has meant very little. The power of the Black church, which when you think about civil rights movement, that's where the civil rights movement started, right? Is in Black churches, and so I think that's interesting, and perhaps they're looking at that history of like, well, even though Black people can be, in this church, they're not voting that way, so maybe that impacts that thought process with the Latinos as well. The other thing that I would say, however, is that because Black people there is this presumption that they would vote Democrat. I have felt like for years that neither political party actually works to earn that vote, because Republicans feel like it's an assumption, it's a done deal, and Democrats also talk about race every 4 years. I'll think about it. I'll encourage you to just get you to vote. I think, right, it's about how do we mobilize both within the Latino community and the Black community to actually get, like, don't just talk to me. I don't need you to just talk to me. I need you to show me. Like, I'm from Missouri, right? And this is a show me state. You need to show me something, because otherwise we can keep voting 95%, and there's still a lot of Black men in jail. And who, by the way, Donald Trump made some criminal justice reform. Republican old Donald Trump made some criminal justice reform. You understand what I'm saying? So,
yeah, I know.
I do think there has to be that action to it, and I feel like that's why Donald Trump was able to say, "Hey, there he is. There's my black friend." That black friend showed up because they were like, "I'm looking for somebody to do something," and the Democratic Party has talked a good game since the '60s and has not done much.
Well, it's the policy issues. I mean, you've got, it's one thing to say things, another thing to do policy that benefits the African American community. Though I think we may have that with Biden in the long run. But anyway, it's
however long he has. That man is old. I keep looking at him like.
I'll edit that out. Also,
don't edit that out. He's old. Mr. Vaca,
you notice it. My pleasure. My pleasure. I was just going to say, if you notice in the evenings, he's not hot. In the mornings, he's fine. But he's like a lot of us old folks. In the evening, you start worrying out.
Yes. All right. So it's been actually a really great conversation. Like, we've really let loose here. We like to get candid and we like to be very honest because Maurice and I operate as building principals. We have to be kind of, I don't want to say stuffy, but, it's just a different type of conversation that we often have. So it's nice to be able to get on this podcast and talk to people like you that, I personally just want to thank you so much for writing something like The Presumed Alliance, because I know you had to take a lot of heat for it. And, it stuck with me. You probably never thought that some little homegirl in Waukegan picked it up and got sent to collections. So thank you so much.
Well,
on Black, Brown, and Bilingue, we like to leave our listeners with one final thought or comment. And so could you close that out? Like, if you could say one thing, is it about the book or, this idea of the Black-Brown divide? What is the one thing that you would want our listeners to walk away with?
My hope is that the Black-Brown divide ends and that we focus on policy and that we unite in terms of our political leaders and manifest our vote and devote it to individuals who are willing to draft and pass policy that affects positively both Latinos and African Americans.
Perfect.
Awesome.
All right. For Black, Brown, and Bilingue, I'm Lissette Jacobson.
And I'm Maurice McDavid.
Muchas gracias for tuning in.